good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whoever you are dialing in from. We appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. We are just going to start right away because I don't want to take any more time away from this really inspiring conversation that's about to unfold. And so welcome to today's webinar, Relationship Infrastructure for Stronger Neighborhoods, the Roles of Government and Social Leaders. My name is Connor Judge, and I'm a manager of communities with the Communities Building Belonging team at the Tamarack Institute. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's webinar. Before we begin today's conversation, I do just want to do a land acknowledgement. And so we do begin this webinar by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the First Nations people, Métis people, and Inuit people on Turtle Island. As part of our commitment to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation process, we recognize the importance of land recognitions as just one small way of honoring and demonstrating respect for the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. I'd like to share that I'm personally joining from Tekaronto, which comes from the Mohawk expression of the place in the water where the trees are standing. These lands are colonially known as Toronto, and this land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. But I'd like to acknowledge that Toronto is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island and the globe. And by acknowledging these lands and their original stewards, I'm trying to position myself, a white settler, within the social, historical, and political context embedded within the lands known as Canada. But more importantly, I'm commemorating Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land.
Merci, Jamie. Thanks so much, Connor, for opening up this space. I'm joining you all today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin, who are an Anishinaabe people. I'm on the shores of the beautiful Kitchissippi, or the Ottawa River, and I just had the opportunity to spend Monday learning with some of my colleagues and with the founder of Indigenous Insight and a leader in reconciliation, Kawas Tenahu Harry. And I'm sitting after that afternoon with what it means to be a gracious and respectful guest on these lands. The idea of being a guest is really present for me. Before introducing my friend and our speaker today, Seth Kaplan, I just want to say one more thing, which is that I can't begin to imagine which of our world's wars and climate and affordability and housing and other crises are with you and those that you love today, and in which ways those things are sitting with you. But I'm really, really grateful to be here with hundreds of you today to explore how we build relationships and relationship-rich places. I'm really, really grateful for the work that you all do to build relationships and empathy and understanding across lines of perceived difference. And I'm really grateful that we can be together in community today to consider how we build the love and solidarity and connection that's possible in our places and which are a pathway to peace and to thriving for all of us. And Seth, I'm so grateful to be here with you today. Congratulations again on the book on Fragile Neighborhoods, a book that I think is so very well timed for this moment. Thank you for your leadership and your empathy and your infectious belief in relationships. You have been so generous to share with me a bit about the experiences that have led you to today. So let's start with that. Tell us a bit about the life experiences and the relationships that have led you to this book and to today.
Thank you, Danya. This book, while it's meant to be highly practical and very useful for people, really the journey to this book starts with my life journey. And I want people here to imagine that they were a child. I was a child, and I had this introduction to the world in which I spoke and nobody could understand me. My mother, to this day, reminds me that when I was very small, she had trouble understanding me. And then I grew up and I learned to communicate better, but I stuttered, and I was always very good in school, but I had challenges adapting to social norms and adapting socially. And therefore, when I got to 7th grade, when people were entering their beginning of their teenage years, I had some really awful experiences being bullied, and it literally changed schools from 7th to 8th grade. And this was all difficult, and you could say it was all character forming, but I think what it led me to do was it led me to have an obsession with the nature of relationships. It led me to have these eyes in which I literally, I had to, for the sake of my survival as a teenager, had to literally go because I wasn't naturally good at it. I had to go and I had to study how people dealt with each other, what were institutions, what were norms, what were social groups doing. And so I developed this obsession, this vision or this understanding that I therefore carried over to an adult. And when I got out of college, the first thing I did was I took off. I traveled in the Middle East. I lived in Africa. Can you imagine me being in Lagos, Nigeria for a period of time when it was not democratic before 1999? And I literally would go months and I never saw a white person. I was there. I lived in the Nigerian home. I went to a Nigerian business and I looked at this country that was very conflict prone, and I studied it and I learned it. And here I am, 21, 22. And then I went to Japan and I lived in Japan for many years. So I went from a country that was very fragmented, a lot of ethnic, religious division, to a very cohesive country. And I think the combination of all these experiences, me as a child, basically learning to focus on social dynamics, and then me traveling to these countries, and I traveled to many countries. I've been to over 75 countries. And then eventually having this obsession with relationships, social dynamics, and why do countries succeed or not succeed? And thinking that relationships and the institutions that support them are the whole key to understanding why a country flourishes and a country doesn't flourish, and then leading that into a career on fragile states. This has basically been what I have done for my whole life, is think about relationships and think about what are the implications of relationships for everything else. And that led me eventually to this book.
Thank you, Seth, so much for sharing a bit about that journey. I'm sorry for those experiences. I imagine, however, that many people here can relate to some of those experiences early on in your life that you described. And to me, the openness with which you just shared is so much of the basis for the kinds of relationship infrastructure that you're teaching us so much about. You have described the relationship crisis as being upstream from all the other crises that our societies are facing right now. Can you say a little bit more about this?
We look at society and we tend to divide problems into silos. We look at the problem of social isolation. I've experienced social isolation personally many times in my life, and I understand what that means. But we have people focused on social isolation. We have people focused on mental illness. We have people focused on deaths of despair or drug overdoses, suicides. We have a whole field that's emerged in recent years focused on issues of trust and polarization. And we tend to think that these are separate problems, but they all are getting worse in parallel. Over the last many decades, we have gone from a society in which we might have had other problems, but we didn't tend to have these kinds of problems. And here we go, we have 4, 5, 6, 7 different social problems that are somewhat serious and have been getting worse year to year. And yet we very rarely think of them as having common roots. And my argument here is that they are all downstream from something that has changed in our social relationships. And I want to put up a couple of slides if someone can help me here. There you go. So I would like to put forth a simple thesis about why we have all these social problems. And this leads me to why I focus when people ask me about why do we have so many problems in our societies? And I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I landed on neighborhoods. Why did I do that? Well, this slide shows what we had for all of human history. Actually, this is not a North American framing. This is a human history framing. People lived in place-based community of some sort. Those places had houses of worship. It had public spaces, might have been markets. It had local businesses. It had retail. It had schools. It had everything was local, and it was an abundance of institutions. And these institutions and the networks that they spawned, people talked to neighbors, people had informal relationships on their streets and around their area, we had loads of networks and institutions, and they were all place-based, or for the most part place-based, and people were enmeshed in them, they were embedded in them, and they overlapped. So there was an enormous amount of spontaneous meeting of people and a lot of organic social development. And there might have been problems, but there, again, this is a recipe for social thriving. This is a recipe for strong social support structures where some eyes are on the street. If you want to think of Jane Jacobs, someone who talks about how the landscape affects how things evolve on streets, or you want to just talk about any strong community. And then we move from this to where we are today. Next slide, please. We have, in the past 2 generations, roughly 60 years, we've moved from a society based on place-based institutions to a society based on networks. And this is very dynamic economically. This is very dynamic for some parts of our society. It certainly has released constraints that held some people back. And so I think there's a lot of great benefits to go to a network-based society. The downside of this is there's a lot of people that don't thrive in networks. I myself have always struggled in networks, so I understand this. I'm the one who goes to the large social gathering and sits in the corner and pretends I'm busy because I don't want to go over and talk to strangers. So I can easily understand people not thriving in networks, but there's also places. Imagine you live in a place and whatever network you have is disconnected from networks that are at the top of society or networks in economically success sectors and things like that. So there's a lot of people that have bad networks or no networks. And therefore, the result is because of these upstream changes in our relationships, we have a lot of people that are isolated, a lot of people who are anxious. They don't have social support around them. They feel alienated from what's going on. And I just think if you experience life today versus 2 generations ago, you feel you have no agency. It used to be that you had a stake in a local institution or you had a stake in a place and you could contribute and do something to make your place better. Now you feel like you're isolated, you're on your own, and you don't have agency, and you don't feel you have a stake in society. Therefore, a lot of people get angry, or a lot of people are alienated, and they're not feeling very good about themselves or society or government or anything for that matter.
And we're going to talk a little bit more later about how we get back to some of those benefits of place that you just described moving away from. But before we go there, you had told me a little bit about, and you talk about this in the book as well, and you just mentioned it earlier in this call, but the dozens of homestays that you've done and the time that you've had the opportunity to spend in neighborhoods literally around the world. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about those places and what you've learned through them and with the people in them about how we can move back to centering connection in the places where we live and work and relax.
First, when I go to a country and I want to study, I did the same thing when I was looking to answer the question, the question, I'm American, so people were asking me, is America a fragile state? And I didn't want to just sit in an office and write. And so when I go to a country, the same way I went into America to study the problems, I insist when I go to a country, I like to do a homestay if I can. I like to talk to the average person. I like to travel around the landscape. The key thing is it's very important to put ourselves in the shoes of what an average person, however you want to define average. Again, there's no one average, but you want to put yourself in the shoes of people. What are they seeing? What are they experiencing? How are they viewing the world? And so I did this, as Danya said, over 30 times. And I continue to think whenever I want to study a society and want to understand what's going on, I want so much to experience in any way I can, like people, not like, obviously books and history and social science and economics all matters, but you want to understand the worldview of people. So that's why I did that. And I think if you contrast the world that I work in fragile states. I, on a daily basis, work on Libya and Nigeria in particular, and to some extent, places like Ukraine, and I support work in Colombia. And this morning I was talking about Sudan and so on and so forth. But if you go to these places have a lot of problems nationally. What they don't tend to have is a lot of problems in your community. They have very strong bonds. They have strong local cohesion. They have thick institutions. Part of its history, part of its culture, part of it is that the government doesn't work. But what you do feel, and I feel it when I'm in a strong neighborhood, like in my neighborhood, I have lots of, I wouldn't say friends, I have loads of relationships, a few friends, but hundreds of relationships. When I walk down the street in my particular neighborhood, I feel like there's a social safety net, some sort of safety net that's wrapped around me that makes me simply feel good, because I look behind the doors and I say, I know who lives here. I know who lives here. If I see someone, we speak or we say hello. I may not know them very well. If I go to one of the 3 restaurants that live near me or the one supermarket, I will always bump into people. When you go to these countries and you see how people live, and then I feel like a strong neighborhood, and there are some of them, not a lot of them these days, you will know a lot of people. You have a lot of places to meet people. You have a lot of institutions you participate. There's a lot of going back and forth, and it's a completely different feeling. And I feel that's what we're most lacking on our daily basis in Canada, the United States, and many other developed countries today.
I really appreciate you mentioning social and cultural capital as being so essential to us living thriving lives, and how that's so strong even in places where systems may have resulted in economic poverty. You mentioned a couple of really practical ways for how we can move into centering relationships. You talked about the movement of people across places and informal interactions, but anything else you can share with us from those experiences in other places about what it looks like to center relationships that might be different than what we're used to here?
I'll say a few things. First, again, I emphasize over and over again the importance of place, neighborhood. Some of us may thrive in networks, but I think we are impacted so much by what goes on in our street, what goes on in our neighborhood. And it's the simplest, best way to have good relationships. Those are the people you're walking by their houses or you're seeing their houses every day. Those are the people you're most likely to meet. And if you're thinking of finding ways to reduce isolation, to support people day in and day out, we don't want to wait for crises before we go and help people. We want to have social support, mostly informal, some of it institutionally. And so I think the first thing I would say is place, neighborhood matters. The second thing I would say is institutions matter. Institutions could be local activities that are hosted on a regular basis, could be neighborhood connectors, as I know some places like in Edmonton has a program to devise or to develop neighborhood connectors, or it could be street connectors or block leaders. But that also could be places where we congregate. It could be bars. It could be cafes. It could be some sort of volunteer organizations that people join over and over again. Institutions are what brings us together. Some of them are simply informal. It could be a bunch of neighbors getting together regularly and doing something to help each other. Community schools could spawn. Without community schools, everyone drives their kids. But if you have a local community school, that will tend to incubate or spawn lots of networks of families, interfamily networks. So I think institutions, and I think the last level to think of is the physical. If we build houses that have, they're simply house after house after house, it becomes very placeless. It basically means there's no place for us to meet. We want neighborhoods that have a center. We want neighborhoods that have institutions. We want neighborhoods that have places to meet. If you live in a neighborhood or live in an area in which there is no identity, there's nothing that brings you together, it's highly likely that you will not know your neighbors and you have no place to meet them. So I think the big thing that I would say is 1, neighborhoods, 2, institutions that are neighborhood based, and 3, a physical landscape that nurtures coming together on a regular basis. Those are 3 things. They're all interrelated. They all combine that are essential to promote strong ties place by place across our societies.
I love that. And they create optionality for people as well, to enter into connection and community through any number of channels. If one isn't right for them, maybe one of the other 3.
Yes. We want lots of choices, and not everybody will want to join. The key thing is I was visiting a friend of mine in an area called Tacoma, which is about 15-minute drive from where I live. And he was talking about how good his neighborhood was. But his point was there was enough people who are active or activated to do things, organize things, whatever it was in their neighborhood. It didn't mean everybody had to do something, but there was a critical mass of people organizing events, helping to, I don't know, it could be everything from holding an event. They have a co-op there. It could be a bunch of local shops that they're involved with. The key point is you need enough going on around a specific place that it has critical mass and it invites. It has to be open and inviting that other people will join. If you don't have the critical mass, you may see a void where there's no opportunities to do anything locally. And that's what we want to most avoid. And that, I think, is where many people are at right now.
It's so important to uplift these creative, grassroots, organic, relationship-based ways of being. They can look so different in different communities, but I think collectively we have an opportunity to talk more about what these structures that don't get talked about enough look like. So thank you so much for those examples. I feel like going back to this question of why for just a moment. Both of us believe so deeply in the power of place, in the power of a group of people who are in the same place can have when they build relationships and get to work together and stay in that work, even when things get hard. Because anytime we start to really get at complex problems, there are moments where things get really hard. That's why we know we're doing complex work. And I'm curious about your why of place. Why is it, beyond what you shared, that this focus on neighborhoods has been such a consistent theme for you?
There's a few reasons. I mean, on one level, I personally have experienced how important it was. And let me just give some examples. My daughter is sick. My oldest child, my daughter, is 11, sixth grade. Her best friend underwent chemo this year. Lives 2 blocks from my house. They're going back and forth on the street. It's so wonderful. My daughter goes to a community school, and 2/3 or maybe even 3/4 of her classmates are within 25 minutes or so walking distance from the house. Her best friend, again, is 2 blocks away. They can get together and they go to the pizza place, which is another block past that friend's house. But the key thing is this friend had chemo. This friend missed a lot of school, lost all of her hair. It could have been an awful year for that family. Instead, because people in the school, neighbors, classmates, because there's a sense that we are in this together, because there's a sense that we are here to support each other. And that's not something you put a finger on that somebody ordered us to do that or some organization encouraged it. It is the norm in my neighborhood. And so that child had a pretty good year. I mean, I see that child pretty often. She finished her chemo a couple of weeks ago, has a clean bill of health, but she's happy. She's smiling. I mean, she got a wig, but she literally takes off the wig. They do, my daughter and her, and I see her and other people, they do bake sales and people are supportive. And she's out there on the street with no hair, 11 years old. And she doesn't mind because a lot of people know her. She receives a lot of support. And so just that, think of the experience this child might have had versus the experience the child did have. I'm thinking of another neighbor. I'm at 910. My street is pretty small. It's 2 blocks long. There's a neighbor of mine at 903. That's a few houses down across the street. I know her mother lives in the neighborhood and is alone. And I don't know if that's the initial cause, but every week I see this person go out of her house and visit lots of people in my neighborhood who live alone. I know she does this because my immediate neighbor on the other side also lives alone. And so she bangs on that person's door. She goes inside. She spends, 25, 30 minutes with that person. And she does it at least once, if not more times. I can't tell, but I see her so often. In fact, since this conversation began a half an hour ago, she walked across in front of my house. So I know she's out and about. I don't know exactly what she's doing today, but I see her visiting these individuals. She's the same person that organizes us to clean up the park, organizes volunteer work to help a local nonprofit. So I personally think that there are so many people in our society that if it's not this informal dynamic among neighbors and among people in your lives, yes, if everyone drove to a school and some of the people in the school wanted to help that child, they could have, but it's not the same as opposed to the security blanket around you wraps you whenever you have a challenge. And so, I mean, those are personal examples, but I also want to put some data points out there. In the United States, I know we're speaking to a Canadian audience, but in the United States, the difference in lifespan is a difference of 41, I believe it's 41 years across neighborhoods. A more typical difference would be 20 years. I spoke to an organization, a healthcare organization, a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about how 2 neighboring counties right outside of Kansas City had a difference in lifespan of over 20 years, probably mid-60s versus mid-80s. So I think we can see, and I'm sure if you look at other data points, there's loads of data points from social mobility to inequality to depression to school outcomes to well-being of families and children, everything, secure crime, everything. It is so place-based, so neighborhood-based. So we can see from personal experience, we can see from lots of data that how well we do as people, it's not some national policy can help, but it's very much going to be based on what is going on our streets and on the blocks and neighborhood around where we live.
I am so glad that that child is doing well. I'm so grateful for the example of that woman who lives.
You should see her smile. You should see her smile every time I see her.
Mm. That's amazing. I want to thank you as well for bringing in those differences in life expectancies. You know, so much of the histories and the policies that result in some of those disparate outcomes are based on policies based in racism and segregation and other forms of oppression that really do impact some of these outcomes that you mentioned being downstream from relationships. So appreciate you bringing that into the conversation. You introduced me recently, Seth, to the idea of working sideways. Can you describe this sideways approach?
Yes. When we think of how to approach problems, and this sideways or horizontal approach is right out of my work on fragile states. But when we typically think about how to approach problems, we tend to think very vertical. For the most part, we look to government policy or leaders to help us or to solve problems. And I certainly think policy matters a lot. I'm not here to discourage people trying to make policy or even politicians better. I mean, voting is very important. Lobbying for things you care about are very important. And then that's top down. There's also some bottom up in which people work in isolation, trying to do something. And I think that's also hugely valuable. What's different about working sideways, it means 2 things. It means on one level within a neighborhood that we focus on relationships as the foundation stone to everything else we want to accomplish. We don't work on silos. We don't work in isolation. We work by strengthening the social foundation or the social dynamics or the strengths of relationships across houses, across streets, across neighborhoods. The more collective capacity places have, the easier it will be to deal with everything else. And many of our policies exist because of our decline in our relationships and institutions. And therefore, policies cannot fix those. We have to find other ways within a neighborhood to fix them. And policies are the second step, not the first step, in my opinion, or the interventions. The second level I mean by relationships is we got to think across. We got to think across our space. We have to think that we live in large countries. Every place is different. Some of the problems we face is because the relationship between places, there could be a class difference, there could be an ethnic difference, there could be exclusion of places. We have to think very hard of the place-to-place relationships and how to improve them. And it often means it might be volunteers from 2 different places coming together. But we also have to think that when we look to better our country, we have to stop excluding places. We have to stop measuring success vertically. Growth in GDP is great, but the country as a whole could get better, and parts of the country could be getting worse at the same time. And I'm all for market economy and all for capitalism, but we always have to think, how do we advance our economy? How do we advance our growth rates? And at the same time, ensure that as many places as possible are being brought along and are enjoying the benefits of that growth. And I think we need to think about relationships locally, and we have to think about place dynamics and interplace dynamics across our whole territories.
Measure progress holistically, network different neighborhoods and places together, and look to build strong fabric within the places.
Yes, yes. I would love if there were better measurements, not of one number that represents all of us, but a combination of lots of numbers, place-based numbers. There are ways to measure success by counting up the success of each of our places. And that would be a different way to measure success.
Okay, we've spoken a ton about local work. I want to step back for a moment. In Fragile Neighborhoods, you offer that the neighborhood might be the most significant way to understand and address our growing social and political problems as well. This seems really relevant right now, and would love if you could elaborate on this offering that you make in the book a bit further.
I think the key thing is we have to understand what it is that constrains us. We have to think hard about what it is that holds us back. I've tried in my book to be very practical. So if you look at how I've approached this problem, I think a lot of people talk about these problems and they work from the abstract forward. And I've tried to work from the practical backward. So if I understand your question, what I've done is that I've looked at different entry points to, and then I looked at specific organizations. So I have 5 different organizations, and I've looked at 5 different places, and I've looked at what each of them is working on. And I've tried to draw out very practical conclusions. So let me just give you some of the practical takeaways because I looked across the 5. So for example, I think children are very important. I think boys in particular are falling behind more than girls. So that's a bit of my contrarian advice, not only focus on children, but focus on boys. I think we need to find organizations like yours that works across places and supports place-based initiatives. I think we need to have better data. Data is very important, but we're not often measuring neighborhood-based data. And I think there's 10 of these suggestions in my book. And what I've tried to do is be very practical. For example, I have a chapter on the physical landscape, and mixed income housing is very important. And creating unique spaces. So you don't just live in a place, you live in a unique place with a center, you live in a unique place with boundaries, you live in a unique place with something special that brings people together. So each of these chapters, each of these stories teaches something different, and then I'm trying to bring them together with cross-cutting solutions. But I would just say in terms of the physical, extremely important that each place has an identity, has a brand, has a center, and has a lot of things in that place. And then if you work on institutions, again, always my second level, first the physical and then the institutions, and again, around neighborhoods, is that we need to look for entry points. Entry points could be family, entry points could be interfamily, entry points could be school, entry points could be community building. We need to find a variety of ways to shape these dynamics so they're creating something like a virtuous cycle so they carry on holistically, organically on their own.
Those multiple points of entry, those choices that you mentioned before, that's really resonating. And as you're talking, I'm thinking as well about some examples where what you're saying is strong here in Canada on Turtle Island. I won't get all of them, but have had the opportunity to learn from Burlington and Hamilton and Kelowna. St. Albert, Cambridge, as well as so many First Nations across the country that have been so strong at centering relationships and community since time immemorial. So we'll share out some of these resources after the session as well, because I imagine that folks on the call would love to learn more about some of the great examples of what you're describing that we see here already in Canada, and that I really hear you describing a vision of as creating as the norm across all of our places. Your book ends with some really practical guidance. This is one of my favorite pieces of the wonderful book. And so for those of us who are working to stay in meaningful and community-centered action in relationship building, can you give us a preview of what some of these really practical pieces of guidance are?
I mean, I have a chapter for institutions and I have a chapter for individuals. So let me focus, and I mentioned a few of the institutional ones a moment ago. So individually, I would urge people, if you yourself, if you think about your life and you think about how you're allocating your time, I think a lot of us feel strongly about politics, and a lot of us feel strongly about different issues nationally. And I don't want to discourage people from focusing on that, but I want to encourage people to think about, instead of sending checks, for example, to faraway campaigns, could we be doing something locally? Could we be volunteering? Could we be supporting? Could we be practically? I feel the best use of our time, if we want to make our countries better, is to focus on the local, to focus on some volunteer activity, to focus on contributing to specific organizations. And that could be through your time, that could be through financial, that could be, I mean, I'm on the board, for example, of a organization for children that have special needs. And I'm on the board, and I'm on 2 committees, and literally once every month, if not more frequently, I'm spending an hour, 2 hours on these meetings in person or virtual, and I'm doing the very best I can to support them any way I can, think about their planning and whatnot. And so I would ask people to think about how you can step out your door and how you can step into your neighborhood or your community, and what can you do practically to help other people. It could be on your own. It could be with a partner, a couple of friends. I encourage you to find 1 or 2 people you can work with. That often is easier if you're just starting. If you're an institution and you're thinking about what can you do, are you focused on individuals, or are you focused on places and the relationships, social dynamics, the institutions in a place? I mean, if you're a government official, is the landscape around that area that you govern or that you or you look at, is it divided into clearly demarcated neighborhoods in ways that help bring people together? Is government organized functionally, or is it organized around place? If it's organized around housing and education and healthcare, you're probably measuring your success by how many of these things you do. But real success is not more housing units, even though we may need it, or more success isn't more hospital beds. Success is the success of places, so they might need less of that sometimes, not less housing, of course, but less healthcare or less support from government. So would you not have a better measurement of your success if you organized around place-based teams? So I think for organizations, and then for individuals, for sure, spend your time, focus your energy. Good to focus on local elections, good to focus on local boards, good to focus on local organizations. Think of patriotism, think of social engagement, think of things you can do that are local, that involves real problems, real people. And the more you do local, the more relationships you will have, and the more you will be engaged with people, and the more actual results you will have on people. I think you have a much bigger impact on people if you focus close to home.
I really appreciate that, Seth. And I just want to maybe offer one more piece to what you said. So many of those on this call today are part of really active place-based partnerships in their communities, groupings of residents and businesses and nonprofits and governments, and all the actors in those places that care about those places, or may not know their places well yet, but are curious about what could happen if they came to feel deep care for those places and cared about those places with other people. And so I see that as one other avenue as well. I know that our friends with Vibrant Communities Calgary are organizing an open house in the coming weeks to introduce those in the community who aren't familiar with their partnership to it. And there's so many examples like that of existing and emerging partnerships that welcome in new people to think with others across all the sectors and pieces of society about how to make those places thrive even more than they do now. Seth, thank you so much. I could keep asking you questions, but I want to share the time. I'm imagining that there are members of our audience that have questions for you. So Connor, would love to have you join us again and share some of the questions that are coming up for other members of our community here today.
Yes, thank you, Danya. And just, thank you, Seth, for this webinar. We have a lot of questions in the chat box, and we just want to maybe send another reminder that if you do have a burning question, please use the Q&A function within Zoom to propose your questions. Our first question comes from Melanie. And so Melanie, thank you for your question. Melanie asks, how do you navigate those sticky relationships when there is offense and deep-rooted issues that can cause distrust, etc., when attempting to build community resiliency and social cohesion?
In my research, I looked at a lot of organizations. One of the organizations I looked at was Life Remodeled in Detroit, which is, for me, was interesting. I went to Detroit and I went to the harbor, and I actually looked south, actually, to Canada. So just to note, there was this part of America that I could look south across the river at Canada. I wonder how many people here know that. So I remember that experience very well. Detroit is a place that to walk around and see what has happened to the neighborhoods, it's devastating. Literally 2/3 of the population have left the city, and there are neighborhoods that are abandoned, in which the houses have been basically fallen apart and for the most part taken away. In some cases, there's still some houses there. It's really like a post-conflict landscape. It's incredible. This organization, Life Remodel, led by Chris Lambert, works in this city to improve neighborhoods. Now, one of his big project, he worked for many years, and then he led up to a big project in a specific neighborhood, and they were going to take over a school, and they did take over a school, and they got a long-term lease, and they were building a neighborhood hub, and they thought this would be great. They had spent time in the neighborhood, they thought they knew people, and yet when they announced the neighborhood hub, and that they were going to bring all these organizations into what was a pretty poor neighborhood. This was a Black neighborhood, and he was white. So there was a racial element here as well. There was a lot of mistrust. There was a lot of concern that he was going to gentrify the neighborhood and kick them out. It really wasn't, he was screamed at, he was called names. And the lesson that he learned, and I describe it when I go through his organization, is that to help clean up streets or to beautify blocks or to help people with their houses or things like that, that is a way of helping, but it's quite different than actually settling down to live and to open up a neighborhood hub in the biggest building in the neighborhood. Even if he's not physically living there, he is coming to live. He's taken over this incredible property in your neighborhood, and it's a completely different type of relationship. And he did not spend the energy, and did not invest the resources, and he did not have a proper strategy to build trust. And he got himself into a lot of trouble. And what he had to learn through some hard lessons, he had to expose himself. He had to admit he did things wrong, and he had to take a few steps back. And gradually he developed a plan, and he learned from doing it, how do you build trust in a low trust environment? That people may not like you, not because of what you're doing, but possibly because of who you are or what they know about you. There could be nothing wrong with what you're doing, but who are you? I mean, it's about the who. The who must come before the what. So in his case, he learned to go along the streets. He learned to break bread with people. He learned to sit down with them in small numbers and talk to them. He eventually sought out leaders in the community that he could put on some board, and he eventually developed 2 boards, a board of like senior statesmen and a board of students, because one of his big audience was students and he wanted their opinion. And then he hired people from the neighborhood. So a lot of his staff became from the neighborhood or from a nearby neighborhood. So literally how people portray him after he did these steps, I believe there's 5 or 6 steps he took, of which I'm describing not the whole picture, but a good part of it. He basically developed the relationships, developed the trust. And so what I would say, I mean, every situation is different. I mean, what can Chris Lambert and Life Remodel teach us is that we need to think of the who before the what. We need to focus on building relationships. It's hard to have a dialogue with people who are going to start off being mistrustful of you or likely to not want to talk with you until you're spending time doing something with them. And again, it depends upon what you're doing. But if you could find something practical that both of you have in common, or that you and other people have in common, you could practically work at. I'll give you one example and I'll stop. In my neighborhood, a very practical thing that people worked on is between us and the little mall that we go to shop in and eat in, there was a traffic light that nobody liked because of the way the signal ran. Well, people got together and they petitioned and they changed the light. That may seem like the smallest thing in the world, but it brought a bunch of people together. Everybody could agree it was important. And so I would urge you to have a sequence of building trust and looking for practical initiatives that you all can agree upon.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seth. Yeah, the one thing I love about your book is just really how practical it is. And I do just want to, put one more plug that, Fragile Neighborhoods is out now, and encourage everyone in the call to purchase it, to really get the full picture that Seth just provided of these practical lessons. I want to now so in your previous example, you did mention kind of housing in the Detroit example. And so we actually have a question from Jill, and Jill is wondering, can you speak more about the importance of mixed income housing, and and also what is required to bring a mixed income building or neighborhood to life?
Clearly, one of the great divides in our societies today is that whereas in the past, for the most part, people lived in mixed income, people lived in mixed income, mixed political. They did not live in, again, I'm speaking more of the United States and Canada, but we were divided by race in many ways, but we were not divided by income, and we were not divided by politics. Today, we have broken down some, surely not all, of the racial divides. They remain, and they still continue to affect our neighborhoods, but we increasingly and significantly are divided by income in particular. If you're wealthy, you might live in a gated community. If you're poor, you might live in a distressed neighborhood. So I think there's a couple of reasons why mixed income housing is very important. First, it's important for the larger picture that we bring people together across many divides. And class is clearly a huge divide that alienates people, divides people, and it reduces opportunity for those who are in the neighborhoods that are falling behind. And place-based or spatial inequality is a huge problem. So one thing is simply to create the bridging connections that will benefit larger society. The second thing is on the local level, it is harder, much harder to make distressed neighborhoods better without having opportunities for people of different income classes to live in them. And if you look at Purpose-Built Community, another organization I researched, and they have a network of 28 different neighborhoods they work in currently across the United States. One of their core strategy for reducing the challenges, the inequality in society in distressed neighborhoods is to focus on building mixed income housing, high quality middle income, and high quality low income housing. This is not just any mixed income, it's high quality at both levels. And it's complemented by community amenities, complemented by investing in schools, mixed income neighborhoods. So how do you do this? I mean, one way is through a neighborhood quarterback, a quarterback set up specifically for the purpose to uplift the neighborhood. And one of its key areas will be working with developers, working with government, working with people with money to find ways, philanthropy, to bring in all the necessary parts so that they can be building enough mixed income housing in a neighborhood so that the whole neighborhood will be uplifted. And I think it also has to be complemented by improving schools and possibly improving retail, improving commercial improving parks and other things. You want a place that's great to live in, and we shouldn't tell poor people the way you get ahead is by leaving your neighborhoods. We should be making all neighborhoods places where we can thrive. I feel my neighborhood is joyful. I think everybody should live in a joyful neighborhood, a neighborhood of possibility. So mixed income and other things we do is to try to ensure that everybody lives in a neighborhood of possibility in which a lot of different people, classes, everybody, different backgrounds, all can live together. It's very important for specific and larger problems.
Wonderful. Thank you, Seth. Just thank you for these examples and these actual concrete things that you're aware of that are happening on the ground. I love that quarterback role that you described in chapter 8. I think it's just such an interesting way of framing, the role that these individuals can play. I now want to we've been really focusing a lot on the individual, what they can do. I know there's a lot of people in government and institutions here. And so there are quite a few questions asking about, what their role is. And so I think that maybe the best way I'll propose Tim's question, which is Tim asks, can you talk about what government and other civic leaders can and should do to nurture these kind of supportive relationships at the neighborhood level?
I feel there's a tremendous need for government. We talk about policy with government, but I feel one of the most important elements of government is how it structures society. And there's very little creative thought. When we talk about government, we tend to think of policy, and policy is mostly about the material. I think the most important role of government is how it structures society. And that means a few things. That means the physical landscape. If the physical landscape is designed around bounded neighborhoods with clear identities, unique features, a center, retail, commercial, that would be mixed functional zoning, but it also means a center, and that brings people together. But there's also the institutional level. When government gives money, is it giving money to large nonprofits that cover a huge territory that work on specific issues? Or is government funding geared in ways that encourage a flourishing of local institutions? I mean, one example is you could do a small grant program to any street in which all the neighbors in the street came together and came up with some very simple plan to improve their street. It would have to be cooperative. They would have to have some skin in the game, whatever that means. And then you have these small grant programs for them to come together and improve their streets. And imagine that was done across a whole city, and that would not be a lot of money, but that would encourage cooperation at the street level. It would give an incentive for people, and there'd be a lot of spin-offs. Imagine, on the other hand, you had government, instead of being, again, I mentioned it before, instead of functional, how about place-based teams? And they were evaluated on the success of places. And those teams consisted of maybe some specialists, but also generalists that could walk around their neighborhoods, made a long-term commitment to their neighborhoods. And their role was facilitating through, could be some investment, it could be working with locals. I mean, these are things that can be done. Imagine if, in terms of giving, instead of giving, again, it depends on the tax code, but imagine instead of giving being rewarded any giving, imagine if there was some advantage for giving to a local, smallish organization within 5 miles of where you live. So there's a lot of things we can do that will encourage people to commit and invest in their local neighborhood. And there's a role for government in how it structures society and how it encourages behaviors and what types of organizations it rewards and how it thinks of the physical landscape. All of these things are very important, most of them are not typically thought of as policy, yet they matter tremendously.
Thank you, Seth. Yeah, what comes to mind me is you need to give to get. And I think small neighborhood grants are really a great example of that. These webinars and these hours always go by so fast. I wish we had more time, but I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. And we're almost approaching the top of the hour. So Danya, I'd like to take it over, pass it over to you for some final thoughts and to wrap us up.
Thank you, Connor, so much. Seth, I'm leaving here with 3 provocations from you and with the question that I'm holding. The first provocations that's really sitting with me is your assertion that the who must come before the what. You also talked about social and cultural capital as being more important in many cases than money and capital in the way that we've been trained to think about it. So thank you for that. I'm taking this idea that it's the smile, it's the knock on someone else's door, it's the sharing of our personal experiences from the previous points in our life that can do so much to build the relationality between 2 people or in small groups of people. And then I'm taking this idea that it's this beautiful mix of physical infrastructure, formal institutions, informal institutions that create the right choices for people, no matter what their passions are, no matter where they're entering into our systems, to have these ways to connect with place. And then the question I'm holding, and thank you for it, is one of wondering how things are organized. There are so many things and they all get organized. And I want to use this time you spent with us as an opportunity to really hold the question of, how is this thing organized? What do I want to be true 10 years from now? What do I want to be true for the children of my children? And how could that be enabled if we thought about organizing this thing around place as opposed to around however it's organized right now? So I want to thank you for that. I want to pause before doing a couple of final closing remarks and gratitudes to our guests here to see if there's anything else you want to add into the conversation before we break for today.
Well, first, thank you to you, Danya, and everyone else on your team. It's been a great pleasure. I just want to leave everybody with the offer. If you want to continue this conversation, or if you have any questions, by all means, find me. You have my website, sethkaplan.org. You have me on LinkedIn. You can find me there. And I would be delighted to continue the conversation in any form. And I just encourage you to think in your organization and in your personal life, how do you make a greater commitment to your neighborhood, or how do you think about things with a more neighborhood lens? I think you can do a lot on your own and through your work. And we all want to ensure everyone lives in a flourishing neighborhood, and neighborhoods of possibility.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you to everyone here who does remarkable work in your places and your neighborhoods. We'll be sharing again some of those examples. But I know that we're here with friends from Winnipeg and neighborhood associations there, and so many other places that I mentioned previously, and many more. So thank you for the work you do. If you're not already involved with Seth, please do take him up on his offer to get connected. As well at Tamarack, if you don't know, we offer several communities of practice at no cost, focused on learning from one another about how to build strong places in neighborhoods. We offer weekly webinars. We have an upcoming session in November over the course of 2 days, which will be online with a couple of in-person meetups as well, focused on how neighborhoods and local communities can work together, specifically around just climate transitions, which of course are so related to relationships and all the other issues that Seth has been speaking to for the past hour. And then we're also launching, as many of you know, what we're calling a national plan on community belonging. And the idea is to really understand and elevate and amplify all of the amazing examples of doing just what Seth has been talking about, of using neighborhood as places to create strong connection, and so many other different outcomes from there. So sign up. We'll share the link in the follow-on materials. We'd love to help design with you a way to really elevate these ways of working, and then use it as a way to catalyze more resources and support for making them more prevalent all across this country and beyond. So with that, thank you again for your time. Seth, thank you again for being here. And everyone, please stay safe and well, and care for yourselves and others.
Take care, everyone. Great pleasure. Thank you so much.